Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today and I want to speak about seniors and vulnerable persons in our society, whether they are physically handicapped, have a mental condition, or other. My bill, C-206, focuses around the sentencing of individuals who perpetrate crimes against people, specifically because of who they are, vulnerable. My bill would amend Section 718 of the Criminal Code by bringing further protection to seniors and other vulnerable persons to ensure that they live in safety, dignity, and without fear. As a former Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer for many years, I have seen many horrific crimes, brutality, deaths, and suicide. Fortunately for me, I've been able to take all that bad, that ugliness, the violence, and I can push it to the back of my mind and I can forget about it. But how much good we did and the people we have helped save and set on a straight course of life is very important to me. But there was always one type of crime I felt I could not accept: the lack of appropriate penalties in our Canadian Criminal Code, specifically for vulnerable persons. My bill would introduce tougher penalties for those who consciously use weakness of vulnerable groups to financially, physically, sexually, or emotionally abuse them. It is difficult for the abused to admit to people that they are victims of abuse, especially at the hands of someone they know and trust. When trust is abused, Mr. Speaker, the penalties should be severe. Perpetrators should be held to account with firm punishments. We must have harsher sentences for these type of perpetrators. Criminals who target the elderly should know that they will not get away with it. Older people should not have to fear being targeted. We need stronger penalties to deter and tackle criminals who target the elderly and disabled. There are hundreds of cases of abuse in which the offenders do not, in my opinion, receive fair punishment for their actions. Mr. Speaker, we should not tolerate or express any sort of sympathy towards conscious cruelty against seniors and other vulnerable groups. Their security should be of concern for us in Canada, and their abuse should be treated as human rights issues of the utmost importance. Mr. Speaker, I must point out that technically, a judge already considers vulnerability of a victim, including age and disabilities, when deciding on a sentencing term. It just isn't specifically stated on paper or in the Act. This bill would simply add it on paper as a requirement. Mr. Speaker, as people grow older, they become more isolated, so the risk of abuse increases. Punishment fails to deter would-be abusers who see older people as a soft target, and we must do more to protect older people, and vulnerable people. C-206 will change that. A large part of the Canadian population is either a senior or will soon be, including myself. I'm already there. The demographic data released by Statistics Canada in 2016 census shows there are approximately 5.9 million seniors in Canada. And according to government statistics, Mr. Speaker, by 2031, there will be around 8 million people aged 65 or older. That'll almost be a quarter of Canada's population. There are many Canadians requiring care and assistance, and their numbers are only growing. Offenders who exploit the weaknesses for the self-benefit and decrease the self-worth and dignity of vulnerable adults and seniors must face greater punishments in law. Statistics provided by the Department of Justice state that approximately 24% of disabled persons were victimized at least once in their life, and about 45% of seniors aged 65 and older reported experiencing some form of abuse. This, Mr. Speaker, is scary, especially when a quarter of our population is going to be in that age bracket very shortly. However, according to the Canadian Association of Retired Persons, only 20% of elder abuse comes to the attention of responsible authorities. And why is that? Because many of the victims do not want to report the abuse for various reasons. These reasons, they include the dependence upon a caregiver who is abusing them, fear of not being believed, or even deep shame and humiliation because of what happened to them. Moreover, in 32% of the reported elder abuse cases, the offender is related to the victim as a child or an extended family member. And I want to repeat that for all of my colleagues here in the room tonight. In 32% of the reported elder abuse cases, the offender is related to the victim as a child or an extended family member. That is shocking, Mr. Speaker. We can only imagine how many cases of such abuse remain unreported, as the elderly are reluctant to bring charges against their family members or relatives. It is therefore the responsibility of all of us in this House of Commons to protect those who cannot stand up for themselves by adopting measures that would deter potential offenders from committing these crimes. And this is exactly what my bill is designed to do. Adopting it would mean two things: prescribing tougher penalties for the offenders and justice for the victims. C-206 covers 4 forms of abuse: financial, physical, sexual, and emotional. I'm going to speak about each to show how they affect
Here are
vulnerable
TV shows
people.
matching the cheese.
Sorry about that. Computer went the wrong way. Typical. First, one of the most common, financial abuse. One of the most common forms of abuse against vulnerable groups. In 2014, CBC News reported that a Toronto police arrested a wife and a husband who defrauded a 94-year-old woman within 4 years of $25,000 in cash, jewelry, and furniture. The wife was hired as a housekeeper and became involved in the everyday activities of this victim. At some point, she forced the elderly lady into a smaller room and moved into the apartment with her husband. If it wasn't for a courier from a local pharmacy who during his weekly deliveries noticed that something was wrong when an unknown person opened the door, the consequences for that woman could have been graver than just the money. Under the Department of Justice, there is not a single reported Canadian case containing a definition of elder abuse. But in fairness, I have to say there are some cases where the extreme age of the victim was taken into the sentencing factor, and this is very good. But my bill, C-206, would take away the use of discretionary decisions and make it mandatory so that the sentence is increased due to the fact that the aggravated crime was against a vulnerable person. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is not new in Canadian law. It is just missing in certain parts of the criminal code, and I want it to be used more broadly, especially for the crimes I have been talking about. Another example, Mr. Speaker, in the same year, 3,000 kilometers away in Edmonton, Global News wrote an article on a man who accused of defrauding his grandmother of $265,000. He acted as his grandmother's attorney under an enduring power of attorney agreement. Fraud and financial abuse in general can occur, not only between family members, but also between people victims trust the most. These cases are connected to trust and dependency on a caregiver who is abusing them, and simple fear of being physically abused, they won't report. This is not acceptable today. These abuses are happening because offenders do not get fair punishment. They rely on the vulnerability of others to take advantage of them. Physical abuse is the second form of abuse I want to address. Statistics show that people with disabilities are more likely to be assaulted compared to people with no disabilities. Another disturbing case happened in Ottawa involving a personal support worker who pleaded guilty to assault charges for an incident at a retirement home, where he delivered 10 punches to an 89-year-old man suffering from Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Mr. Speaker, in many years in law enforcement, this is one of the worst types of crimes I've ever encountered. Should such offenders be treated equally to those assaulting healthy and capable people? Mr. Speaker, I don't think so. Their punishment should reflect the gravity of their crimes, and currently those abusers, even if convicted, rarely get punishment. Advocates for the people with disabilities confirm that vulnerable groups are often abused, and I think we need to just look back at the report that came out yesterday. People are being picked on who are vulnerable. In October 2014, CBC posted a story about a 19-year-old mentally disabled woman being sexually assaulted on a bus in Winnipeg while her support worker was sitting a couple of rows ahead. I'm a father and a grandfather. To me, a 19-year-old is still a child, and what this child experienced is traumatic for both her and her parents. She has a right to be safe. That's why we need a stronger law. In the spring of 2017, a support worker in Ontario walked away with a guilty plea for only one count of assault and no criminal record exchange for court, withdrawing 13 counts of sexual assault. We need to be stiffer in our penalties. This is where my bill, C-206, would come into play. The vulnerable in our society should enjoy an increased level of protection. They need to be confident in our legal system, and they must be assured that those who would try to use their vulnerability will always get a fair punishment. The last but not least form of abuse I would like to cover today, that is emotional or psychological form of abuse. I would like to add that all previously discussed forms of abuse are very much connected to an emotional abuse in a sense that they have a great psychological effect on the victim. There is no dignity in disrespect of a vulnerable person. There is no dignity in taking advantage of a vulnerable person. It is a crime, and it must be punished in a greater way than it is being punished for now. The cases I have talked about are not single cases. There are hundreds of them out there, Mr. Speaker. How do we change? Canada needs harsher penalties for those who exploit vulnerable people and take advantage of their weaknesses. Tougher penalties for the abuse of vulnerable persons who would make abusers think twice before committing these kinds of offenses, and provide more safety for those who cannot protect themselves. My bill, Mr. Speaker, would make those criminals who disrespect and use other weaknesses would not be able to get away with simple conviction or a guilty plea, leaving victims' families, friends, desperate and disappointed in our criminal justice system. Is that my time, Mr. Speaker? Thank you.